So the Orton-Gillingham approach is an approach that's going to be very systematic. It's going to start with the easier information, and it's going to build from there. It's going to have a very detailed scope and sequence. So again, nothing's being left to chance. It's very explicit. You're not just hoping that they catch on. You're going to make sure you're telling them what they want to learn, and then you're teaching it to them very explicitly. And then you're giving them lots of application in that skill. So you're giving them information, and then you are working with them to apply that information in writing and reading, single words, moving into connected text, and then ultimately working on accuracy and fluency, right? The Orton-Gillingham approach is going to be diagnostic. As you go, if it's not working, you're going to do something different or add more. Perhaps they need more explicit instruction. Perhaps they need more time. Perhaps they need a smaller group setting. You're going to be monitoring their progress regularly, and you're going to be adjusting your instruction to meet those needs. You're not going to let anything like happen by chance. It's going to be very very strategic, right? And very systematic. And then also multisensory, right? So the more senses that we use when we're learning, the more actual circuits that we're creating in our brain for retrieval. So one thing that I do when I'm working with students one-on-one is I will have them be looking and tracing and saying it, and they're hearing it as well, right? So they're saying it, they're seeing it, they're hearing it, they're feeling it. And time and time again, I've been so amazed when I've seen some of my students, who cannot remember how to spell an irregular word. For example, let's say the word said, right? Because the word said has three sounds, d, but that middle sound, well, normally that sound is represented by the letter E. So how many times have we seen kids spell the word said, S-E-D? Pretty common.
Right.
That's the sound that they're hearing, but it's not spelled like that. And so they are stumped often. And if I would never ask them to do this if I hadn't already taught it, right? But if I know we've worked on it and it's in there, but we have to retrieve it, and just off the top of their head, they'll say, I have no idea. And I'll say, okay, let's try and trace it and see if that jogs your memory. And they often look at me kind of like, whatever, like, I just told you, I don't know it. And they'll start tracing it and saying it, right? Luckily, the first letter, is regular. And so they'll be like, S-A-I-D. Oh, and you can just see it, like they're in shock. And I've just seen it happen over and over. So anyway, that's just a fun little anecdote about how multisensory instruction can be so helpful in
Mhm.
a surprising way. Like, well, you know what? This is how our brains actually are mapping those sounds to the letters. And even if it seems silly or like, oh, I don't think this is going to work, the research is telling us otherwise, right?
Yeah.
So that was a little anecdote, but it's backed up by lots of research about how our brains orthographically map those
Mm.
words. Anyway, so that's
So cool. I did not know that.
yeah,
That's so
that's
cool.
a little synopsis of the Orton-Gillingham approach. And then I can tell you a few areas that I know have fallen short. And that is, first of all, our pre-service teacher training programs. So our, higher education teacher training programs. So many of them across our country are not teaching evidence-based approaches to teaching reading, or how our brain literally works and what is happening. And we have decades of research showing that. When I discovered that, it was really frustrating for me, because what our like cognitive researchers and neuroscientists know about how our brains learn how to read, it's like there's this divide. There's a drop off between what they know and what educators are being taught. And not only are they not being taught so often effective measures, but they're actually being taught balanced literacy or whole language approaches, which have been debunked for decades and shown that they just do not have the components necessary in those curriculums to meet the needs of what our kids' brains need and literally require, right? So what is kind of the gold standard is what we call structured literacy. Structured literacy is based on the fact that reading is not natural. In fact, Dr. Marianne Wolf, who I love, she's the author and of many books and that are just so inspiring, and also she's just a fabulous researcher and professor. She said in the very beginning of one of her classic books, Proust and the Squid, she said, "We were never born to read." What a simple sentence, but literally our brains were not wired to learn how to read. It doesn't come naturally. Now, language comes naturally, right? You're going to learn how to speak without explicit instruction as long as you are spoken to, right? But reading does not come naturally. And the problem is that, first of all, knowing that is really helpful when it's, especially for kids that are struggling. If you tell them, hey, listen, this is actually really hard, and you literally have to rewire your brain. So give yourself some slack, have a little bit of grace, and give yourself some mercy, you know? And, but then also this is created a really big problem in our education across our country, because if our brains were not wired to learn how to read, we literally have to do the work to rewire them. It's a
Mhm.
it's a man-made code, right?
Mhm.
So it
Yeah.
makes sense. It's like, well, we have to teach our brains the code. And so many teacher training programs are not teaching that. They're actually teaching these debunked ideas that about balanced literacy, that if you just expose kids to enough quality text and language, that they'll learn how to read. And yes, reading to our kids and exposing them to great vocabulary and literature, that is all important, and that does help build a component that is necessary, right? Vocabulary, that's crucial. Background knowledge, that's crucial. All like the grammar and syntax and semantics and all that, those are important. But just as we wouldn't just say, hey, listen, if we want our kid to become a piano player, right? We don't just say, hey, listen to Mozart playing the piano and you're going to pick it up. You just need to try harder. I mean, when we talk about that, everyone always kind of giggles and it's like, oh, well, of course they're not. They need to be taught, right? Well, it's the same thing with reading. Is like, we have to teach them. So yes, building that foundation of oral language, crucial, so important. We have to have, like, think about Velcro. We have to have this oral language foundation of the known word, right? They have to know the word. If they don't know what a table is, if they can decode that word and read it, but they don't know what it means, then they still don't have reading comprehension, right? So you have to have that oral language foundation and understanding, and then you have to have that decoding or word recognition ability, and then you can have the end result, the end goal of reading comprehension. And those are not being taught in our teacher training programs, and they then, of course, our teachers are going in and just feeling like, oh, I don't know what I'm doing, and my kids are struggling and I don't understand why. And then in addition to that, so many schools are using curriculum that is balanced literacy. Some of them are mandated to use them. Some teachers who do know better are being forced to teach curriculum that's ineffective, or they're like secretly closing the door and saying, okay, I'm going to teach you some phonics because I know it's important, but I don't want to get in trouble for teaching you effectively. And
Mm.
gosh, that's a problem.
That's hard. Yeah. Oh my goodness.
I don't mean to sound dramatic, but my kids will giggle, laugh at me, and be like, oh, mom, here she goes again. But really, like, kids that don't learn how to read, it's life or death,
Mm.
in that it really affects their whole life trajectory in so much. And like, our country knows this in so much
Yeah.
that they literally use our fourth grade NAEP like the nation's report card data to determine how much space to have in the prisons.
I did not know that. That's
Yeah,
wild.
that's really sad and
That is terrible.
so heartbreaking.
So that's interesting with the specific learning disability like criteria too, because I don't know if you've known this, but it's such a high percentage of inmates that have been not diagnosed, but have met eligibility for an IEP for SLD.
Yes,
Yeah.
I do. In fact, do you
Wild.
remember this statistic, right? About 80% of inmates are functionally illiterate.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I didn't even think about that.
I
Oh my
mean,
goodness.
so that's what they call it, the pipeline to prison, the prison pipeline. Like,
Oh, school to prison pipeline.
yes, there it
Oh,
is. Thank you.
yeah. Well, and I think it's so important to talk about your child because you are an educator, your husband is an educator. It's a solid household, right? Like you guys enjoy education. You probably passed on that love of education to your children and seeing the behaviors that followed when your son wasn't supported appropriately. Like literally look at that. That's a textbook response when you're frustrated at school. You have adults that are not really thinking that it's serious, but they're just thinking you're not trying hard enough. And then you have parents that are advocating for you, but like what would have happened if you just stopped? Then the behavior would have continued and then the ability to read and be able to do well in school even goes down, especially as the demand for work goes up as grades go up. You're impacting a lot of future for a lot of children.
Kids want to be accepted more than anything. And that's the other thing is that they would rather be known as the like problem kid than the stupid kid.
Yes.
Or they'd rather be known as the class clown
Yep.
than the kid that can't read, right? And so they
Mm.
act out to cover it up. And the thing that I can't remember who said this to me. It might have been one of my professors, but I honestly repeat this to myself on like almost daily. And this is kids want to do well, and if they aren't, it's because they can't.
Mm.
And so we really need to provide necessary supports for them because if you just have this mindset of this kid really wants to do well, if you have this idea that as a parent and, it's hard, I get it. I have 4 kids. I know how hard it is. Sometimes you're just like, ah. And as a teacher, if you have this different perspective, like this kid really wants to do well, that changes a lot.
Mm.
It's gonna make you approach things in a really different way.
Yeah, it's so true. Like assuming best intention, especially I'm talking about like early elementary, right? Like most kids want to please, they want to do well, they want to be similar to their peers, they want to be liked by their teacher. So I want to explain a little bit about the school psychologist side of things when we look at specific criteria, because when we're looking at specific learning disability, we're looking at one of the 13 main categories under Individuals with Disabilities Education Act or IDEA. You see if a student qualifies or not based on specific criteria. So I wanted to go over that really quickly. That criteria is a disorder in one or more of the basic psychological processes involved in understanding or using language, spoken or written, that may manifest itself in the imperfect ability to listen, think, speak, read, write, spell, or do mathematical calculations, including conditions such as perceptual disabilities, brain injury, minimal brain dysfunction, dyslexia, and developmental aphasia. Specific learning disability does not include learning problems that are primarily the result of visual, hearing, or motor disabilities, of intellectual disability, of emotional disturbance, or of environmental, cultural, or economic disadvantage. Okay, so when we look at that category as a whole, we see that word dyslexia in there clearly. It's literally in IDEA eligibility code. According to the California School Board Association, I sent this to you. A third of students who received services under IDEA in 2021 to 2022 had a specific learning disability. And when you look at the eligibility for SLD, states have 3 main methods that they use to determine this eligibility. So we see dyslexia in the code, but school psychologists are not trained on dyslexia. And then you look at the 3 different models that a school psychologist can use when they have a child that might be struggling. That first model is the discrepancy model. This method compares a student's academic performance with their intellectual ability through use of IQ tests, etc. A significant gap or discrepancy between the 2 scores suggests a learning disability. For example, a child may score lower in reading compared to their IQ score as a total. And so this model is largely used throughout Southern California and specifically here where I am in LA. That's the predominant method that's used. Then we have response to intervention. So this approach involves monitoring a student's progress through tiered levels of intervention. If a student fails to respond adequately to evidence-based interventions at various levels, they may be identified as having SLD. I had a professor specifically in my master's program who argued that this was like the best method. However, it's largely dependent on the individuals at the school to not only implement evidence-based interventions, like you're saying, they're not even trained in it, right? But to monitor it with fidelity. The likelihood that that's going to happen is not very high. And then the third method, this is the one that I'm most familiar with, patterns of strengths and weaknesses approach. So this method assesses a student's cognitive processing abilities and academic performance to identify a specific pattern, including a learning disability. So it looks at areas of both strength and weaknesses to determine if there's a significant discrepancy between expected and actual performance. The one I'm the most familiar with, I appreciated using it because it really specifies the research-based links between deficits or weaker cognitive areas and how they might negatively impact specific academic areas that, again, the research shows are connected. So, for example, if I test a child and they score in the well below average range in their auditory processing, but in the other areas of their cognitive profile, they're in the average or barely below average ranges. And then they also scored below average in reading comprehension, for example, or reading fluency. Research would suggest that the weaker area in auditory processing would be what is specifically negatively impacting their academic progress, which is indicating a learning disability, but it would also indicate something like dyslexia, whereas the discrepancy model and the RTI approach totally miss that specific caveat for dyslexia. When you look at the cognitive processing profiles of students with dyslexia, you know this, I'm sure. The main processing areas that are impacted are phonological processing, the orthographic processing. So, like you said, recognizing written words, understanding letter patterns, affecting reading fluency, the rapid naming, which when I hear that, when a school psychologist hear that, we literally give a test quickly naming letters, numbers, colors that can totally hinder reading speed, working memory. You mentioned this, issues with holding and manipulating information temporarily. That totally impacts reading comprehension, automized naming, so slower retrieval of words affecting fluency, visual processing. Some individuals may struggle with visual perception and integration. That can complicate reading, right? So when we're looking at reality that dyslexia is a huge problem, teachers are not trained in it very well. Admin are typically, as you've known yourself, are pushing parents to say, hey, let's just wait. You know, he's not behind enough yet, so let's just keep waiting. And then you have the issue of there's 3 different methods that a school psychologist would even look at when it comes to addressing specific learning disability. You're looking at an entire population of kids that are completely missed. And then you throw the behavior aspect on top of that, and schools are always going to look at the behavior first because that's the bigger issue, that's the bigger elephant in the room that's impacting other kids' learning. So they're always going to look at that first before getting to the deeper issues. And then you put time in there. The longer kids struggle, the longer they are like, I'm done failing. I'm just going to stop trying. And then I'm going to hate school. I don't want to go. I'm going to continue behavioral issues. And then, even as we talked about, right, the school to prison pipeline,
Yeah.
it's a reality. Like, that's literally where kids could be headed on this specific trajectory, which is so hard. And so, as someone who is well versed in dyslexia, you've worked with your children specifically, you worked with other children that have this diagnosis. What strategies would be the most important for parents and educators to be able to support children who might have those red flags that we talked about before they even receive an IEP. Can you share a little bit about what you would hope that they would be doing?
Yeah, actually, it's a really simple answer. In fact, it's kind of frustrating how simple it is because it's being neglected still. And that is universal screening, meaning that starting in kindergarten, all kids are screened for these essential literacy skills at a minimum the beginning of the year, middle of the year, and end of the year. Now, if a child at the beginning of the year is showing they're not at, the benchmark where we would hope to see them at this time of year in whatever grade they're in, then they should get intervention. They don't have to have an IEP to get intervention, to get extra support. They should get intervention immediately, and they should then have more regular monitoring to make sure that intervention is working. So a universal screener, I use Acadience Reading, and it's free online even. Educators can download it for free. Honestly, a universal screener, so we're not letting these kids fall through the crack, and we're not just saying, they're struggling, and then getting to the end of the year and maybe giving them an assessment and saying, oh, shucks, they're still behind. Oh, well, I guess it's not my problem anymore. I guess their next year's teacher can try and figure it out. I'm sure they're so smart. I'm sure they'll catch up. That's just such a huge red flag and so ineffective. And that those first 2 years of school are so crucial. Guess what? So many kids in third grade can't read. They do not have these word recognition skills because they were never given the skills that they needed that were foundational, like phonemic awareness, like the alphabetic principle, like basic phonics. You have to have that foundation or your tower will crumble. You cannot build it. I guess it won't crumble. It can't even be built. I've heard this a lot. It's just false to say that you can't identify dyslexia until third or fourth grade. Or this idea that oh, suddenly we have all these third graders that are struggling readers. No, there's been red flags all
Yeah,
along. You've just ignored them and you've just said,
100%.
let's wait and see. And guess what? That hasn't gotten you anywhere but you've dug yourself a big hole. And now that kid is 3 or 4 years behind. Now, as a private tutor myself, when I started going into this, I envisioned myself working with first and second graders, maybe third grade or something, who are oh, we're struggling. They need some help, foundational skills. Okay, great. You know what is reality? I'm working with fourth and fifth and sixth and seventh and eighth graders and high school students because they never got that. And they were told to just wait and see. And guess what? Now they're in a really difficult situation because now they're so many years behind and it's not their fault. Kids internalize that as that something's wrong with them. And there's nothing wrong with them. They just haven't been taught in a way that actually works with how our brains learn how to read. Now, some of them will need more repetition and maybe they do have dyslexia and it's going to take more practice and more repetition and more all that. But still, it's not their fault and they're not dumb.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really heartbreaking to see that happening. Dyslexia is not rare. As many as 1 in 5 students have dyslexia. So for a teacher to say, which I've heard lots, well, I've never had a student with dyslexia. Well, you may not have a student who's diagnosed with dyslexia, but for sure you've had students with dyslexia. And you know what, to be honest, I'm a dyslexia specialist, but I don't really care if they have a diagnosis. If they're struggling to learn how to read, they need intervention and they need
Yeah. I just looked up, even in my last school district, the 28% of elementary school students were at or above the proficient level for reading. 28%. And I'm talking up through sixth grade. And speaking as someone who was in a lot of those student study team SST meetings, right, for kids that had been struggling for years and they were told to wait and all of that stuff. I know teachers, admin, anyone listening, even parents are going to recognize oh, my kid takes a test at the beginning, middle, and end of the year. At my previous district, we did iReady. It was all computer.
I was actually going to bring up iReady because my kids' school uses that too, and it's pretty widely used. And the problem with a computer generated assessment is it misses too many crucial bits of information.
Hmm.
When you're talking about reading and you're talking about sounds, you cannot assess that effectively through a computer.
Hmm.
You can't. You cannot take the person out of that and have an effective assessment. So that's what I want to say first of all. And then second of all, this is just going to be very like first thing, and there's so many layers more that we can talk about this in the future. But oral reading fluency, also known as ORF, ORF, is a standardized, research-based, predictive, um, valid and reliable measure that literally takes 1 minute to, well, up to 2 minutes to administer. Have a child read a connected text to you, and then up to 1 minute for them to then retell what they learned, right? And do you know, in that 1 to 2 minutes, so up to 2 minutes, you are measuring advanced phonics, accuracy and fluency in a connected text, and comprehension.
Hmm.
All of that in like 2 minutes or less than 2 minutes. And I use the Acadience reading measures because they're backed by decades of research, and they're not all created equally. But that can be given as starting at the middle of first grade. So if it like kindergarten and beginning of first grade, there's some other ones that you can give to really help you assess risk for reading failure, and risk, potential. But oral reading fluency, middle of first grade onward up through sixth grade, can be given. And it's not only can be given as a universal screener, but it can be given, and it's effective and predictive as a progress monitoring tool. So
I
with
love that.
with my students that I'm working with privately, 2 to 3 times a week, I'm giving that to them, sometimes as often as every week or every other week, but at least once a month.
Hmm.
You do need time to give them more instruction, right? But I have the luxury of not having a full classroom and focusing on that one child, and I'm going to say, okay, is this working? I
Mm,
graph the progress, and is this working? And if not, I'm going to add in more or do something different or add more application, whatever it may be.
right.
It to me, it comes down to that. And again, yes, I could talk about a lot more details in that, and maybe
Think of your initial experience and how you basically were fluffed off and admin told you like, you know what? No, he's smart. Like he's not like a special education. You don't want special education.
right.
Um, I don't think any parent is going to their school, knocking down the door saying, my kid better be like in special education with a disability. No, they're just saying my kid needs help and I don't know what to do to get that help. It's just really good to hear about the process of leading up to even before the assessment process. You should be having an entire series of meetings where you're discussing what the concerns are. You're discussing the strengths. You're building interventions around the strengths that the student is already having. And then you're saying, okay, we're going to monitor data. This is exactly how we're going to do it with this form, right? That you even mentioned. And then we're going to track it even every 2 weeks because it's only going to take 2 minutes of your time, right? And then after 6 to 8 weeks, we're going to see if there's any progress, if there's any change. I'm sure with your students, if you looked at a 6 week period, you would see something,
Mhm.
right?
Right.
You would see change or you wouldn't, right? And you would be like, okay, if you don't see any change, we either have to get different supports that are more intensive.
Right.
That's the response to intervention, right? Or we move into determine if this child has a disability.
I wanted to say this back when you were talking about your process as a school psychologist, and that is, you're saying it. These are all the different assessments that I could give to help determine whether a child has a specific learning disability, and they have to have that's one way that they could qualify for special education. Well, I was told by multiple people at the school that school psychologists do not diagnose dyslexia. That's outside of their realm, and they are not going to give you a diagnosis. And in fact, they've been scared to even say the word dyslexia or include it in the IEP.
So, yeah, with that, I think part of that is lack of training, right? So you can't speak to medical diagnosis ever because eligibility categories are totally different than medical diagnosis. So you wouldn't necessarily speak to that. But what I'm saying is under IDEA code for eligibility, they list dyslexia in there. And why I think it's so important is because when you're looking at the processing areas of cognitive profile and you see the academic areas and deficits matching up, you can look towards, okay, if you have a background or even a little bit of knowledge about dyslexia, you're able to understand, oh, that's why this kid might be struggling. I'm not going to come to you and be like, your kid totally has dyslexia. But I will say, these are the weaknesses in the cognitive profile, these are the weaknesses in academic profile. They qualify for a
Right.
specific learning disability.
I actually have put together a parent teacher conference guide because of exactly what happened to me. I went into this parent teacher conference, when my son was in kindergarten and was just blindsided. And
Mm,
and I'm realizing so many of us do that and we don't know what to ask. And
yeah.
so it's just like knowing what to ask for. And so that's a freebie that I'm putting out on my Instagram page. All kids can. So you know, I feel like empowering parents to even know what to ask for. And
Hmm.
I mean, it's just so important because you cannot assume that their progress is being monitored. You can't assume, and this is not a dig on our hardworking teachers because teachers are working so hard. They're under supported, they're under resourced, they're underpaid for sure.
Hmm.
And they're doing such a monumentally important job with no support and no validation and it feels like so little understanding in our society of how valuable this is and their job is, and it feels like a mission impossible, right? And so I really like to approach it like, listen, it's not me against you, it's I want to be on the same team, and this is
Hmm.
what I'm seeing at home, and I want to be in this together. And I also have realized that, you know, um, despite really wanting what's best for our kids and our kids when they're in their classroom, they don't necessarily have the training. Most don't have the training in teaching reading and identifying dyslexia. And so you really have to speak up and listen to your gut and advocate and say if something feels wrong, it probably is. And
Hmm.
move forward. And so in this free guide that I created, it's basically walks you through different questions that you can ask the teacher to find out, do you know what your child's reading curriculum is? That's a
Hmm.
important place to start. So also I will just give a little plug for, and this, I'm not affiliated with this at all, but a fabulous podcast that really is so easy to understand for parents, educators, anybody, that I recommend to everybody, is called Sold a Story by Emily Hanford. I bet you would love it if you haven't heard it yet, but it's a series of podcasts that even my kids enjoyed listening to because it's told really well. And uh, it really outlines the history of reading and how it's been taught in our country and why so many kids in our country are not learning how to read. I'm sad to say that the most recent NAP statistics show that, um, you know, 2/3 of our nation's kids are reading below a proficient level.
Right.
So you were saying the statistic in your school district or your area, 28%, that's not that far off from the national average too. So national average is 32%
Yeah.
are
Wow.
reading proficiently. And it's like,
Yeah.
okay, only 32%? This is scary. Why isn't this more urgent to people. Like when I hear that, I'm terrified
Mm.
because, that's a lot of kids that aren't being taught how to read.
Know you have the free guide, so I'm going to make sure to put your handle in the link below so people can find you on Instagram. It's all.kids.can, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, that's on Instagram, and then they can get your free guide there. And then do you have any other resources or things that you offer parents?
Yeah, so I am happy to offer free consultations to parents. I'll do a 20-minute free consultation where we'll discuss your top 3 concerns and actionable steps to address them and how I might be able to help you. And then I also offer private coaching, where I'll, help you work through what's going on, and really give you the information and support to know what to ask for, follow up, help you write letters to the school. I even will sit in on IEP meetings when somebody really needs like an advocate and extra support there. I even bring an advocate with me when I go to IEP meetings because when it's my own child, the emotions are run, pretty high. And having an extra set of ears and somebody who can think clearly and to help you take notes and make sure that you're not forgetting anything is just super helpful. And then I also do foundational reading assessments. And I am located in Hawaii, but I can work with students anywhere around the world, online. And a foundational reading assessment really includes specifically looking at what are the kids' strengths, what do they already know when it comes to their reading and writing and spelling, and where are their gaps. So I actually use Acadian's reading measures as well as diagnostic measures to like really dig deep, and that gives us a really clear snapshot of what does this child still need to learn? What do they already know? And where should we go from there? What would the recommendations be for this child as far as how are they going to progress and get up to where they can feel confident and be meeting benchmarks and really having that an ultimate end goal of reading comprehension, right? And that's all based on where they are, what grade they are, what age they are, where they are in their school year, and all that. Now, if I assess a third grader, for example, and I give them an oral reading fluency passage that's at a third grade level and they're not doing well, then I'm going to survey back and figure out where they can find success. Because there's really no sense in trying to get them to read a third grade passage if it's just frustrating and overwhelming, and really they can find success in a first grade level. Okay, so then you're going to take it one step up from there and build gradually until they can get up to that benchmark, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so that makes total sense. Thank you so much, Michelle, for sharing your insights with us today and your expertise. For our listeners, remember that early intervention is so key, and being informed is a huge aspect of that early intervention process. So be sure to check out our show notes for the links for sources mentioned in this episode. And until next time, keep advocating for your children or students' educational needs and make sure to go with your gut.